World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. As North Korea appears to be preparing for a nuclear test, negotiations resumed between North and South Korea, and there was even a bilateral meeting between the United States and North Korea. Are we seeing a change in U.S. policy toward North Korea? The U.S. also pressured China to reduce the value of its currency, a move that would reduce the ballooning U.S. trade deficit with China. How might this move affect U.S.-Chinese relations as well as the U.S. economy? We will look at these stories, plus events in Uzbekistan and Iraq, with our World Affairs panel. Joining us today are John Katzka, a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who has engaged in public diplomacy on 4 continents and was recently recalled for a 3-month tour of duty in Paris. Ann Hamilton, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. Professor Hamilton also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And George Martin, program director with Peace Action Wisconsin. Mr. Martin has participated in peacemaking activities in Iraq, Brazil, and other parts of the world. Welcome to International Focus. Well, we have, again, our usual packed agenda, and I wanted to start us off with looking at North Korea and sort of the sort of policy environment here. And as we talked about in the open, the U.S. has had this bilateral meeting with the North at a somewhat lower level and has made some guarantees about not attacking and recognizing sovereignty. And John, I'll start with you again and maybe go to Ann as our diplomatic people with diplomatic experience here. How do you read this? Is this a run-of-the-mill kind of thing, or is this actually a significant change?
I think it's a significant change, and I think it shows part of the more pragmatic leadership that Condoleezza Rice brings to the Secretary of State position. And not that her predecessor was not a pragmatist, but she has more ability to be able to affect these policies.
Can you expand on that a little bit, John, in terms of how, what is that Rice brings to this? What leverage does she bring?
Well, first of all, she's a confidant of the president, and she is as close to him as any other of his advisors. That's a very important thing for the Secretary of State. The other thing we should recognize is that this was described as a working level meeting, which means that these were not senior officials that were involved. Our spin on the story was that not exactly the way the North Koreans would put it, but it does show that we wanted to get a couple of obstacles out of the way. One is that we weren't going to destroy North Korea. And second of all, I forget what the second point was.
Recognizing sovereignty.
So recognizing the sovereignty of.
And how did you see it?
I agree with John about the pragmatic approach. I also think that the United States sees this as an opportunity to repair some of our relations. I mean, it's a good diplomatic opportunity. In a way, we need to use this it's what looks like a very bad situation may have some positive outcomes in the sense that we need to work with our European allies on this. We need to work with China and Japan on this, and it can help to restore some of our credibility in the world. The fallout from Iraq and a lot of other issues in the Bush administration, if we can work together on the issues. So I think that there could be some positive spin-offs from it, from what is really a very, very dangerous situation, and everybody recognizes it as a dangerous situation. So we really are forced to work together on this.
Yeah, and I agree with all that's been said, and I think it's a step forward in terms of that relationship with North Korea. And at the same time, the UN non-nuclear proliferation review treaty talks were going on in New York. There were 40,000 of us in Central Park 2 weeks ago. And we've held the line and not changed our policies in that setting. And we're going to talk about China a bit more, but the role of China in terms of supporting non-nuclear issues and non-nuclear countries in our taking the stance that we still have the right to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear countries is the bottom line. So what's come out of this last 2 weeks in New York City.
Let me differ a little bit from part of what they're saying, and that is you were saying this will gain us greater credibility in the world. I would suggest that in the North Korea issue, we have been much more multilateral in our approach, and everyone was focusing on how we went into Iraq. In North Korea, we worked with the 6 countries involved. And the interesting new development is now that the EU wants to get a leg in this discussion. I'm not sure where this is coming from. This is a real wild card because they have no particular interest in this. They have no foreign policy apparatus at this particular point, the EU. In Iran, where this is going on, it's 3 countries that are represented.
So isn't this a chance for, as you were saying about the is really the pragmatic, what's pragmatic about this approach is saying, yes, we need the 6-party talks, but we've been a bit sort of stubborn in not also using bilateral contacts with North and South, with us, and is that the change?
And I think with the Europeans, The Economist had an editorial saying that, the Europeans, instead of, sort of saying, hey, we told you so, you haven't done this right, now you're really in a bad position, that the Europeans shouldn't be doing that. They need to jump in too, because the danger is clear to everybody. I mean, it should be expanded to include all parties who care about the possibility of North Korea having nuclear and testing nuclear weapons. It's very serious.
The point you raised, George, about this. If you look at, the EU has taken the lead with Iran. We've taken, and the 6 parties talks have taken the lead with North Korea. But in effect, this is all part of the same regime to try to control the spread of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Let me take us on to a related issue, George. You kind of opened this door to China, and I want to start with the issue, the economic issue, or at least seemingly economic issue of the U.S. After a lot of pressure from internally, putting pressure on China to let its currency float. And just for those of you that aren't economists, China basically pegs its currency to the U.S. dollar. So it's not value. The market isn't setting the value of the Chinese currency, and economists say this is leading to a 40% overvaluation of the currency, which means Chinese goods are 40% cheaper than they would be. They have a huge trade surplus with us, and if we let the currency float, then that will just create a sort of more legitimate economic trading system. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying to China, hey, let your currency be what your currency is? What do you think, Anne?
Well, there are all sorts of issues that are interrelated, so it's hard to just take the economics of it in. I mean, we're used to this with China from the past, with the whole the tying together of human rights issues and trade issues, and now we just see it on what seems to be an even larger scale. It's not so much human rights, but it has to do with the fact that the Chinese are buying our T-bills. So a lot of people are saying that in fact this is good for the United States because it gives them money to support our debt. And then we also want the Chinese to help us on the Korean issue. I mean, so there are just a lot of different issues that are tied up, and it's very hard to isolate them and do what seems to be the right thing if you just look at it on its own.
George?
Mm-hmm. Well, there seem to be some recent moves on China's part to make things work a little bit better, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of increasing their own tariffs and trying to make adjustments so that the rest of the world isn't as distraught about their own economies diffusing.
Yeah, because China, as again, just a review of some recent history, that textile quotas have been removed. So recently, and when that happened, Chinese good textiles have flooded into the United States, into Europe, and China is now taking some voluntary moves to try to curb that. So, John, how do you see this as an economic versus all these other issues that Anne talked about?
Well, let's look specifically at the currency, and I would see it. Most communist countries don't look at economics through an economic eye. It's a political question. And I would say that the Chinese Communist Party would be very reluctant to give up the kind of control that they have over their currency and their economy if it was freed up and allowed to float internationally. I'm not sure how much effect that would have on the direction of their economy, but people who like to control things don't want to give up any of that control in the process.
Well, and people we had Charles Freeman here, our head of our trade talks with China, saying that the biggest issue from the Chinese perspective is unemployment. And I imagine that if you do things that reduce Chinese exports, it makes it a whole lot harder to control that very critical issue, as you're pointing out.
I mean, they have a infrastructure that is not capable of maintaining the level of economic activity that they have right now, and so they're wrestling with a monster of sorts that keeps pushing out goods, and they haven't quite figured out, nor has anyone been able to advise them on how to get hold of this again.
And you had mentioned the China's buying U.S. Treasury bills, and the numbers, as I read them this morning, seem to be rather startling at an average of $250 billion a year over the last 2 years, which, if you look, that's approximately the size of our budget deficit right now. One of the worries is that if you let the currency float, those Treasury bills get a lot more expensive for the Chinese, and they stop buying them. So there are those who talk about this sort of internal U.S. constituency that, as you were saying beforehand, this is not such the currency being pegged to dollars, not just a bad thing. So what happens to those folks in this?
The people who believe that
this is a good deal for us.
In all of these trade issues, there are winners and losers. That's sort of a cop-out from this. But I just think the fact that they're so interconnected. I was thinking when you were talking before about the euro, how we don't want to lose out to the euro, have the euro gain ground as the international currency against the dollar. So that comes into play as well. The way I'm reading this at this point is that the concessions that were made this morning on the textiles, which were quite a surprise. The agreement to impose export quotas, the Chinese to impose export quotas after they've just gotten this multi-fiber trade agreement lifted so they can have free trade in textiles, maybe their way of trying to relieve pressure on this yuan issue, particularly because the Senate is supposed to vote, and they are saying that they will impose a 27% tariff on all Chinese imports if the Chinese do not do what we want with their currency. So maybe this is their way of trying to prevent that they care more about that, and it may sell well to the American public, because if this whole issue of the T-bills is stressed.
So short term, it seems like it may actually be in both the U.S. and the Chinese interest to kind of let this currency issue kind of die away, and
maybe,
if there's some move on the textile side.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment here on International Focus.
Countering Anti-Americanism, a Long-Term Strategy. Join Senator Russ Feingold and Julia Swig of the Council on Foreign Relations for a discussion of today's anti-Americanism, the American state's primacy in the world, and the role of U.S. citizens in responding to the challenge. 7 p.m. Tuesday, May 31st in the UWM Student Union, Wisconsin Room. To register, visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu or call us at 414-229-3220.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. Let me switch us over to a little bit to the west of China and talk about Uzbekistan. In Central Asia. Now, most Americans, I think, probably don't know Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. There's this whole part of Central Asia that's not terribly well known here. But again, just to refresh the state of play, Uzbekistan has been a staunch U.S. ally in the war on terror, war against terror, has let us use their bases to launch attacks in Afghanistan, and has received over $500 billion in security assistance. And then they recently, though, had this crackdown on a demonstration. Now, there's two pictures here I'll paint for you and ask you to help us sort out where this goes. On the one hand, you could see it as an ally of the United States dealing with its own internal Islamic terrorist problem. I've also seen the picture painted of this is a brutal autocratic dictator who killed hundreds of people who were demonstrating for democracy and in an era when the U.S. is trying to promote democracy, and the U.S. hasn't really done much to help them. So, George, let me start with you as to, well, where do you come out on this spectrum?
Well, I'll tell you, the position of Uzbekistan, just being northeast of Afghanistan, put them in a position that gave the attention that they might not otherwise get because of that access and that air base. And the 500 million in terms of, working against terrorism. But then within the country, we have this situation of long-standing human rights abuses. And these recent situations, probably two different kinds of situations, and both with an Islamic base. And so from the leadership of President Karimov, this is the war on terrorism. But from the inside, it may be looked at in terms of people really looking toward freedom and a change from tyranny.
And how do you see it? I mean, how do you sort through the mists of what's happening there?
I think that it's clear that I think that there's an element of truth in both, in the sense that there has been some evidence of terrorist attacks, particularly across the border. There's also a linkage there with drug trade across the border, and this is not the first instance. There's a long history of violence in that area and Karimov crackdowns. This is just the one that's got the most attention because it's the most threat to Karimov. But I think that he is a brutal dictator. There's evidence that he has, allegations that he has boiled prisoners. Just terrible. And the United States has come down, not very hard, but has actually, Rumsfeld on a visit talked about human rights abuses with Karimov. So we're sort of, we're caught a little bit between a rock and a hard place, but I think here we need to err on the side of respect for human rights and come down hard on Karimov.
How about you, John?
I'd like to take a slightly longer historical look. Central Asia has co-opted almost every ideology and ruler that they've ever had. The Romanovs picked clans and were used by clans in their period of time. The same thing happened with the Soviet Union. Right now, Karimov is still a carryover from the old regime, but he is not likely to be replaced by any Democrat. He is more likely to be replaced by other clans and another dictator who is not going to behave significantly different from what we're seeing right now. It does put the U.S. in a hard place, and this is where we talked at another time about dual track, where the pursuit of democracy is a strategic value, but there is the war on terrorism and the need for tactical connections, and they are very useful in that respect.
Well, I guess in some ways, just to bring it up to that more strategic level, you just mentioned, John, about the promoting democracy, and it seems as though we've seen demonstrations happen in Lebanon and in Egypt and other places, and this has been a very positive thing. But there may be places like you're mentioning in the Central Asia where talking about democracy can be a pretty dangerous thing.
Well, and what do you mean by democracy? The ability to replace one leader with another leader is not democratic action. Free elections by themselves is not democracy. There's a whole list we talked at another time about a civil society, which encompasses a range of things from an open, transparent legislature, judiciary, and executive.
So what should U.S. policy be now? What's the right response to this, given that these dual interests that we have? George, what do you think we should do?
I think we should support an international investigation. I think we should work with the rest of the world multilaterally on this. And then based upon that, if it warrants sanctions to change policy within that government, I would fear us working to replace leadership like we've done in other places and it become a worse situation. And so I think we have to work in that fashion.
In fact, I think we are already. OSCE, which we are the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, in which we are a member, is there and has, I saw a press report this morning coming out focusing on criminal elements who were involved in the opposition to Karimov. But I think we will go. This is a very comfortable one for us to take a multilateral approach on.
I'm sorry, Ann, did you want to come?
Well, and bilaterally too, we don't have to try and change leaders, but we certainly can withhold some aid that we've been given them. I know the State Department has come out against that, but there have been waivers for aid that we've given to the government in the past. We can put pressure on the Karimov government and public pressure and point to its human rights abuses. And still follow the other track, I think, at this point.
And the commanding general in the area also noted, I think it was yesterday or today, that they had reduced the amount of activity that was occurring out of our air base in Uzbekistan.
Let me take us to another touchy exercise in promoting democracy and ensuring security, which is in Iraq, and a few developments which I think warrant some reflection. One is the increase in violence following a lull in violence after the election, but starting with the formation of the new government. Second, we again hear there was a little bit of talk of perhaps we could get our troops home sooner rather than later, and we had some generals coming out, Pentagon coming out saying, don't get your hopes up. And then also recently a story in the LA Times about the U.S. reasserting its role in helping to manage, taking a more active role and setting what it calls red lines, which are places that the government can't go, but going beyond that and actually trying to mediate and help to push issues along. There was this sort of period after the election, formation of the new government, where it looked like, hey, we might see an endpoint. Have we lost that chance? And let me ask you, are we back in now for the long term? Is it?
Well, I think that the public opinion polling that's coming out of Iraq shows that the support for the government there has gone way down from the period after the election. Yeah, we were talking before the show about the fact that although the opposition is not united there is opposition coming from a lot of different quarters. I don't know. I think we're in a really difficult position there.
John,
I don't think we should be surprised that the public opinion polls have gone down. That generally happens after the euphoria of the election. And then the reality of putting together a government and making it work is the realization whether or not this is improving my life. And there's going to be a fall off in that. It was going to be a long run in the first place. Anyone who thought we were going to be able to pull troops out in a hurry were just mistaken.
George?
It's such a difficult situation. In these last 30 days, the amount of bloodshed and killings has just escalated. And at the same time, we talk about this violence. The condition of the country, being a majority kids under 14, being a majority women. Malnutrition has doubled in children up to 6 years of age. 1 out of every 4 kids doesn't get enough to eat. There's such wretched living conditions. Electricity is still at 4 hours a day. And Iraq is not being reconstructed. At a demonstration in Halliburton, one of the employees came out the other night. He said he just got back. He said there is no reconstruction. And that's an awful sin. We need to use our dollars wisely. These are our tax dollars. We need to work with the Iraqi system so that Iraq can rebuild itself. They did that in 3 months after Gulf War I. They had full electricity and full telephone. And so I think living conditions and also the fact that we're there. And it looks like we're going to be there for a while, and that's not going to decrease any of the bloodshed, and it's going to continue to increase.
Well, I promise the next show we'll probably lead with this issue, so we can give it the time that it deserves. But I want to save some time and ask you each to raise an issue that you'd like us to be paying attention to in the days and weeks ahead. John, let me start with you.
Kosovo is back on the U.S. radar scope, and a process will begin probably in August, where the UN will send in a special arbiter to look at the process of whether or not Kosovo will become independent, and they will bounce between Belgrade and Pristina, the capitals of Serbia and Kosovo, trying to come up with some sort of an accommodation. The best I can see is that they'll make Kosovo independent, but with a UN overseer to overrule outrageous actions on the part of the Kosovars.
Great. Ann?
The whole issue of our intelligence services is not an event, but the fact that now there's with the issue of North Korea, which we started with, the fact that we can't figure out whether the grandstands are for a nuclear test or not, I think that we're going to start scrutinizing this big problem with us in our intelligence, and also with the problem of the arrest of the former CIA agent who the Cubans and the Venezuelans want. I mean, I think that intelligence is going to be a big
George,
problem.
I'm shortchanging you and giving you 10 seconds.
10 seconds. September 24th. This week, calls came out across the country. Major peace coalitions, United for Peace and Justice, I'm a co-chair, 1,400 organizations, will be convening on Washington, D.C. for the weekend for a positive end in terms of rallying for peace and also to lobby.
Great. Thank you all very much. And thank you to our viewers. We'll see you again next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,